Hey everyone, welcome to another video. In this one, we're going to be painting plastic Death Korps of Krieg. Can you believe it? Plastic ones. What a time to be alive. I always wanted this to happen, and finally it's here. So really excited to do this tutorial with you. My aim for this was to do a kind of dark style that I think suits the Death Korps of Krieg. You know, that kind of painting style that we found in the Forge World books, the Siege of Vrax and all that stuff. These guys are supposed to be, soldiers not having a great time, and I wanted to reflect that in the painting. So I wanted to stay away from techniques like edge highlighting and focus more on weathering and things like that. And the other bonus for that is I think it's generally a little bit quicker, and this would make it more possible to do an army with, or even just a kill team of 10 of these Death Korps of Krieg. I started with grey primer, and that is simply because that's the primer I have. I'd probably go for black if I had any in stock, but since COVID I have not picked up any Chaos Black spray, which is my usual preference. I'm going to be using the airbrush today, of course the Cult of Paint airbrush, but you don't have to have an airbrush, so don't be put off. I'm just using this to get down the initial colours. I'm spraying the whole thing Rhinox Hide. If you sprayed it black, then you could just brush on Rhinox Hide all over. And I think brown is quite a nice foundation to start with everything else we're going to do on top of that. I got a little bit of analysis paralysis when it came to the green, and I tried so many out, and I had loads added in my shopping basket, and I thought, you know what, I don't need to buy any more greens. I'll use something that I have. In the end, I settled on Castellan Green for the base coat. And here you can see I've got this olive green from Vallejo, and later I actually switched this out to golden olive, which I think works much better. So in these first few steps, you're going to see me using olive green, but you'll see in the captions, go for the golden olive. I think it produces a nicer colour. So I start with the airbrush, and I've got Castellan Green in there, quite diluted, and I like the brown undercoat because when we're sort of spraying with the airbrush and we start off with quite thin translucent layers, it will leave a nice sort of brown shadow, and I think that will contrast quite nicely. If you're just using a brush, then I would build up the Castellan Green in thin layers, but you can leave a little bit of the sort of Rhinox Hide in the recesses and stuff if you like. The first pass of the airbrush really doesn't do much, but it does form quite a nice shadow with the thin Castellan Green sprayed over the Rhinox Hide. Now I just build this up and get it opaque and do a second layer, and this time I'm trying to spray a little bit more from above. I'm trying to get subtle highlights here. I don't want like really powerful volumes or anything like that, but I think it's nice to have some shading. I decided that I needed it to be a little brighter, and because I knew I wanted to add a lot of weathering, I thought I should start maybe a little brighter with the green. Honestly, I think you could just do a flat base coat of Castellan Green and it will look really cool, maybe a bit more grim dark than what I ended up with, but adjust this to your taste. What I did here was add some olive green from Vallejo into the Castellan Green, and in retrospect I would have added golden olive here. I actually ended up repainting a bit later on with that mix, but I would do it in this way. In the end, I really like the result. I'm glad I went for the airbrush because it's given me a solid foundation for the green, but I think you can get an amazing result with just the brush. It'll probably just take you a little while longer. On this model, we're basically going to be doing lots of different materials, and they're all going to stem from browns, sort of light browns, dark browns, just different boring tones, to be honest. So I start blocking everything in, and I'm using this scale 75 Artist Burnt Umber. I really like it actually. I normally use Vallejo Burnt Umber, but this scale Artist one is very, very dark. Maybe a bit too dark, but it's very versatile, and if you dilute it a fair bit, it's a really nice colour to work with. So I start base coating the boots, the trousers, the mask, and everything I want to be really dark in this colour. There's other parts like the sort of stuff on the back of the backpack and the strapping around the feet. They're going to be a bit lighter, so I just leave those out. The parts that I wanted to be lighter, I base coated with Scale 75 Gobi Brown. One of my favourites. It's awesome for doing natural looking material like this because it dries very matte and it's just a nice boring colour, to be honest. But yeah, I use it all the time. Love this one. Now I had some rough base coats, I decided to add a little more highlighting to the green, and this is completely optional because it looks really good if you've just airbrushed it, and we're going to do loads of weathering, so lots of nice highlights could get covered, but I decided to do a mix, Castellan Green with golden olive, and just add a little bit of highlighting and some scratches of green to start with. I also highlighted some of the folds in the cloth. The only problem with highlighting is it will obviously make everything brighter, and that could take away from the feeling of this being quite a grim, dark model. So you've really got to take into account the style and the look you want to go for. I'm happy with the highlights because that kind of goes with my style, and I know that I can knock these all back with weathering later. So this is very much a personal taste thing, I feel. So do it if you want. The black parts get a very soft, and what I mean by soft is a wide highlight of Eclipse grey. So this isn't an edge highlight, we're just trying to leave a little bit of black in shadow. So on the shoulder pad, using rough brush marks, I just add a little bit of texture and light to the top. Most of this will be covered in Eclipse grey, leaving just a little bit of black on the bottom. And with the las rifle, I actually just paint a strong line all the way across the top, and then I also catch some of the edges that face upwards on the gun, but don't edge highlight everything. And yeah, you don't need to do much with this, but just one nice highlight I think works really well. With the highlight on the shoulders done, I added some decals, and we've covered this in some other videos, so check that out. One of the most important things to hide your decals, make sure they go invisible, is to use a varnish after. And here I'm using AK Ultra Matte, which you see us use a lot on the channel. And I really want this figure to be really, really matte because it will contrast nicely with some of the effects I'm going to do with oil paints later. So this is definitely a good stage to ultra matte the whole model. And then when we do our metallics and stuff, we won't be varnishing it at the end. So it's on to battle damage now, which is super important for the style that I wanted. I'm using Rhinox Hide. You could also use the burnt umber we used earlier, but any kind of dark brown is going to be fantastic. When I do battle damage, I focus on the edges. So instead of an edge highlight, I'm actually going to put this brown, and you can use the side of the brush to catch the edges, but then you also want to add some little chips. I like using a small detail brush and just being very careful, trying to add the smallest little chips I can. I think it's difficult to keep it in scale with something like a sponge when you have a small area like this, so I just try my hardest to do lots of teeny and subtle chips, and I think that definitely adds to the realism and makes it kind of gritty looking. I also use some brown leather from Scale 75, and this is a much more orange brown than Rhinox Hide. It's a bit lighter too, and it really looks a little bit like rust, so it's fantastic to have a variation of chip colour, and you can actually paint it on the inside of some of your Rhinox Hide chips if you want. But this will show up on black a lot better basically, whereas the Rhinox Hide looks great on the green. I put a little bit of brown leather around the rivets of the gun to represent some rust, but later we're going to use oil paints, which I think are superior in every way. But if you don't have oil paints, then you can do it with this acrylic at this point. For the gas mask, I did a mix of burnt umber, which we used for the base, with the Gobi Brown. And I just kept adding Gobi Brown to kind of lighten up the mix. And then I did a final highlight with Gobi Brown on its own. I don't think you need to go any brighter than this, otherwise it will start to look a little too highlighted. This should be quite a dull leather, and you can use this leather recipe on other elements to the model as well. It's really tough because you have all these different leather elements and you want some variety, but you don't want to go crazy. So I used a limited palette of browns, but tried to make sure I got a few different mixes out of them. So for the trousers, I went for olive brown from Vallejo, which is another favourite of mine I always use, and I just painted really big highlights here the burnt umber almost looks black in this shot, so I covered most of this area with olive brown. For the highlights, I added Walnut from scale 75. This is an awesome colour. It's a very boring cold brown, but it's nice to mix up the cold and the warm browns, so I used that for this part, and I kept adding a little more walnut until I had enough highlighting on the trousers. I went up to pure walnut, and that's definitely a good stopping point, I think. For the eye lenses, I just base coated them with Gal Vorbak. I didn't want to do like a highlight on here because it would bring too much attention to the lenses. I just wanted them to be dull basically. So this really dark red followed by a white dot I think was the way to go. And although that seems a little bit basic, actually I think it looks great in the final result. For the strapping around the boots and the little bit on the backpack, I took the Gobi Brown, which I'd base coated them in, and I just started to add Deck Tan from Vallejo or AK and just added that in until it was bright enough. I didn't want it to be pure Deck Tan because I think that would be too pale. With all these dark colours around it, I didn't want it to stand out too much. On the backpack thing, I don't know what to call it, but this thing at the top, I did add a couple little extra highlights at the top, and they were pure Deck Tan, but I was quite reserved with those. So the final recipe I used for the materials was another nice easy one, and this was Rhinox Hide, gradually adding in Gobi Brown. And I used this for the backpack, the boots and the gloves, kind of anything left to be honest. And it's just a great easy recipe to do. So I paint kind of big, large textured areas here on the backpack. And I combine that by doing lots of sort of scratching brush strokes. I think it's nice to do subtle little lines and texture, and it doesn't take too long, especially since you've saved some time with how we're painting this model in general. I think for this, it's worth adding that little bit of extra texture and things like that. I do finish with a sort of edge highlight where I'm catching some of the edges, but I'm also doing little scratches and stuff from that. But yeah, I really like this recipe. You'll see me use it all the time, and hopefully you've got a nice variety of different leather colours, but we haven't used too many different pots of paint for it. So at this point I think it looks really good. We've got all the different materials down, which was always going to be the most time consuming, and we're going to finish with some metallics and some additional weathering now. If you want to give it another ultra matte varnish, this is your time, because we're going to do the silvers and we don't want to do any more matte varnish after this point. I'm using Iron Warriors from GW. I really like this over Lead Belcher. It's got a bit more character to it, and I use this in my dry well palette now, not my wet palette. So I base coat everything I want in this colour, but as well as that I do some battle damage. So where I've got the Rhinox Hide chips, in some of the areas I add a little bit of this silver, and that's to represent sort of freshly done scratches as opposed to the old ones. And I think this kind of building and layering of two different types of chipping colour with the two browns and some silver starts to really add some nice depth and feel to this model. And I also pick out a couple of the rivets and things like that as well. The final part before the basing is going to be using some oil paints to do some weathering. Now, if you haven't used an oil paint before, this is definitely the sort of model you should try it out on, because you can't really go too wrong, and we're going to use them in a simple way. I'm putting them here on a piece of cardboard, and that helps to, dry out some of the oil, but actually I didn't have anything else to put them on, so that's why I went for it here. I took some raw umber paint, and I wanted this to be some mud at the bottom of the cloak, and I started out with it pretty much neat. I had a little bit thinner on the brush, but then I started to add some quite thick blobs to the bottom of the coat. And the advantage of the oils is you can kind of wipe them off with some spirits and things like that. So anything you don't like, you can rub away. So that's one advantage. And the other thing, and the main reason I'm using it, is the finish and the aesthetic. There's something about the way it dries, and in this case, it's a little bit satin, which looks amazing for mud. It's not too glossy, it's not too matte, it's kind of just right for this application, especially over the ultra matte that we did. After I've applied a few blobs to the bottom, I put my brush into the thinner and then I just start to fade it away by adding a little bit of thinner to the edges, and it just blends in so easily. I really encourage you to try this if you've never done it before. It looks amazing, it's easy, and it's actually really fun. I love this step. You can also use this paint for mud around the boots. I did a little bit on the strapping, which I think is really important so it's not too bright in that light colour. And then I also thinned it down with a lot of thinner and did a very careful filter over the decal. And the decal is such a bright white that we definitely need to dull it down. We put some chips and damage in it, but this just very light wash over the top will knock it back, and I think that's a really important step. Now for rust, I'm going to use burnt sienna, which is a much more orange oil paint, so it's perfect for rust and other things like that. And I just put a blob in an old base I have. I'm actually using 28mm bases for all my Krieg. They come with 25s, which I thought were a little bit small, so I bought some 28s. So I have these 25 spare, and I just used that to make a little wash of this orange rust. And with this, you just very carefully add it to all the rivets and just subtly add it to some of the more boring areas. It works so nicely on the black because you haven't edge highlighted it, but with the weathering of the silver chips and this little orange in the corners, I think it looks really great and helps to add to that really grim dark kind of aesthetic. There's just something intangible about the way these colours look when they dry, but they just feel way more natural. So you might think, oh, I can do the rust with my orange paint, but honestly, there's just something about this. It looks better in my opinion. So I wanted to show you a quick comparison of the 28mm bases I used. So they come on 25s, and I was like, whoa, these are tiny. And then I tried the 32s that we have our Marines on, and they're definitely too big. But the 28mm base, or 28.5 to be precise, is a new size that Games Workshop started producing, and yeah, I just like that little bit of extra real estate. I think it looks great, so I'm going to use these for all of my minis. I glue some sand, which I have a little bit of smashed up concrete in there mixed with for some variety. And for the technique I'm going to use for this, it's important that you glue the sand on after, because I want the sand unpainted by primer. The reason I don't want it painted is because I want to take advantage a little bit of the natural colour. So I grab some neutral grey and I add to that a little bit of olive brown to make it more natural looking. And I dilute this pretty heavily. And that's so, one, that we get a little bit of the sandy colour coming through, but also you get amazing capillary action. It just makes actually physically painting these bases super, super quick. Now, when you see this finished base, you might not like it and think it looks unpainted, and that is totally fine. I just wanted to show you a way that I think looks cool. I think it looks really natural, and it's probably one of the quickest ways to do a base. So I like it, and I thought I wanted to show it to you, but I can totally understand if you're kind of not digging the look at the end. But in the hand, in person, it just looks so nice and realistic, so I think it's great. When it's dried, I like how you have a variation of colour, because some of the stones that didn't really get paint stuck to it, you could apply this paint a little heavier and it would look, well, a little more painted, less like this. But now I'm just going to finish it with some Vallejo pigment here. So I really like this colour. I've been using it on most of my models recently, and I've got this impossible idea that I'll have an army that all has the same bases, like some Death Korps of Krieg mixed with some Citadels of Battle, but being realistic, I don't think this will happen, but you can dream, right? So with this powder, I just put on a little bit at a time, and that's because it can go everywhere. And I just use a dry brush and carefully rub it into the recesses. Now, for my personal taste, I prefer the look of powders when they have not been sealed, because as soon as we put a sealer in, it spreads everywhere, it goes a little bit paler, and I just don't like the aesthetic. I like how matte this looks, how raw it looks. And like I said, this isn't going to be to everyone's taste, because it kind of looks unpainted, I guess, but for me it just looks so natural that I absolutely adore it. So you can see me just working a bit quicker now I've got some confidence with how this powder works, and I'm just rubbing it in there. But if you rub it enough with the brush and get it really in the recesses, it won't go anywhere. It will last for years. So I also add it here to the bottom of the boots, as you can see. So there you go, that's the base with the powder on, and I've obviously painted the rim black, the only colour to paint the base rim. And yeah, I love the look of that base. I think it complements the colours of the model, just a really boring drab colour. But yeah, I'm a fan of this, so let me know what you think if you like these bases, and of course what you think of the model as well. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. There was quite a few things I wanted to achieve, and I wanted this to be a really easy tutorial to follow, as in I wanted all the processes to be simple. I just wanted to provide you with some cool recipes and encourage you to paint in this heavily weathered style. I think the use of no edge highlights, lots of chips, lots of scratches, and particularly the oil paints really works for Death Korps of Krieg. It makes them look like they're not having the best day, and they're definitely stuck in the trenches. And yeah, I just absolutely love that style. I think the more military modelling style just goes with these guys. I'd love for you to leave a comment if you like the colour scheme, if you like the processes, if you've never tried oils before and then you try them after this tutorial. I'd definitely love to see that in the comments, so please do. And I only had time to do one of these because I wanted to make sure I got a tutorial out to you as quick as I could. But I do hope I can paint the other 9 of these and have the full kill team. So watch out for social media, and hopefully I do. I'm not saying I definitely will, but I really want to at the time of filming this video. But you know, new stuff comes along and then we'll get to that. But I'm also thinking about doing a Macarius tank. It's one of my favourites ever, and I want to do it in the same green I've done for this miniature. So as always, if you like our stuff, check out our Patreon. I'm doing lots of Horus Heresy stuff at the moment, like Sons of Horus at the time of filming this video. So if you like this kind of heavily weathered style, check that out too. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video.